So we've looked at setting up bones and binding artwork to them, but now let's look at some of the cool features that your bones can have that will make your animation process easier. First, I wanted to explain a couple terms that are important when you're talking about rigs. Those are inverse kinematics, or IK, and forward kinematics, or FK. By default in Moho, when you make a chain of bones like we've been doing with a parent-child relationship, it automatically makes it an IK chain. That means by selecting the end bone on the chain, you can drag it where you want it, and it will automatically rotate the parent bones in the chain. This is inverse kinematics. By the way, notice that when you have a branch in your skeleton, like the shoulders branching off the spine here, that joint gets treated as the root of the IK chains. Next, when you're on the timeline animating, you could also work the opposite way, either using the Bone Transform tool or by holding Alt with the Manipulate tool, and just rotate one bone at a time going down the chain. This is forward kinematics. In general, it's going to be faster and more natural to use IK, but you might find things behave weird, like limbs bending the wrong way. So to help with that, we can add some constraints to our bones to make them behave in a more predictable and powerful way. First, use the Select Bone tool, and you can select a bone or select several bones. Then up here on this drop-down, you have a bunch of parameters you can set. Let's start with the angle constraints. These define how far you can rotate a bone in either direction. So like for the wrist here, we never want the hand to be able to double back onto the arm, so we can set its range of motion with the angle here. And you can see the limiter line represented on the bone. Then when we use the IK chain, it's not going to ever go the wrong way. Next, there are cases where you might want to enable an independent angle. So for example, if I enable it on the foot bone, the foot will maintain its angle relative to the stage even if we move the rest of the leg. You can still animate that bone's rotation directly if you want, but it just won't get rotated by moving its parents. Next, there's a really cool setting called Squash and Stretch Scaling. With this enabled, when you're animating and you use the Transform Bone tool to shorten or lengthen a bone, the artwork bound to that bone will have a squash and stretch effect. This value here determines the strength of that effect. Now the next option, Maximum IK Stretching, is related, but to see this in action, we need to change how we're controlling the IK chain by adding a target bone. I'm going to use the Add Bone tool and just click to create a pin bone. And oops, we don't want that parented to anything. We want to be able to move that freely. Then I'm going to take the bone strength down too, because it doesn't need it. And I'll give it a name. Then on the last bone in the chain, I'm going to set its target bone to that pin bone we just made. And you can see it gets a little target symbol on it. Now if I move the target bone around, the IK chain tries to match its position. Then if we select the bones and increase the maximum IK stretching higher than 1, and let's also turn on Squash and Stretch too. Now when we move the target bone, it lets the arm stretch a little farther than normal if we want. Now in the case of an arm, you might not want the hand targeting the bone. You could instead set the target at the wrist and have the forearm targeted instead. Now you can stretch the arms and still have the hands free to rotate however you want. And if you do intend to control an IK chain in this way, you can select the bones for the chain and set them to shy bones. This just hides them to make your display less cluttered. To show bones you've set to shy, go to Bones, Show Hide Shy Bones. Also notice that if you move the root bone of the character, the target bones don't move with it, if it's not parented to the root. This makes target bones really useful for legs. Say I set up some target bones for the legs. In this case, I'm drawing regular bones instead of pin bones to make them easier to grab. With those set as targets, I can position the feet, and then even when I move the root bone, they stay in place. This is really useful for doing walks or jumps or anything where you want the foot to stay planted on the ground for part of the animation. Next, there's this checkbox here for ArcIK Solver. This is most relevant for cases like this where you have a chain of 3 or more bones. So by default, when you have a chain of bones and you adjust it from the end, most of the bend will come from the point at the end you have selected and gradually work its way up the chain. However, if the bones are set to use the ArcIK Solver, it makes the bones a little more rigid, so the bend gets pushed back to the root and spreads out along the bones more. I'll warn you that the ArcIK Solver can be kind of unpredictable. Like here you can see I can't get this tail to bend the other way. I would recommend avoiding this and try using the other techniques we'll cover to get the results you want. The next constraint you might want to put on a bone is ignored by inverse kinematics. So remember, when you have a branch in a bone chain, that joint where the branch starts will get treated as the root for the IK chains that branch off from it. So for this character here, there is a bone chain for the head and neck, but it stops at the shoulders, so basically you can't move the spine by pulling on the head. However, if we wanted to be able to do that, we could select the 2 shoulder bones and enable ignored by inverse kinematics. And now the head IK chain will run all the way down to the hips. However, now those shoulder bones won't be moved by the IK chains of the arms either, which is actually probably better for this case anyway. You would just have to rotate them directly when you want them to move. Next, we have drop-downs here for control bones. These can be useful when you get into more complicated rigs, but the idea behind them is very simple. It's just a way to make one of these properties of a bone be controlled or influenced by another bone. This is generally either to make controls that are easier to work with in cases when grabbing parts of a character directly would be tricky, or you can use these to make certain animations happen automatically. For example, I have this bone chain set up for this chameleon. And let's say we want to make a separate control for the first tailbone here. I could just draw another bone out here. First, let me go back to frame 0. And I'll give it a name. Then on the tailbone, I can set its angle control bone to point at the one we just made. Now that bone's angle is controlled by this bone. And this value next to the dropdown lets you define the ratio of how much change gets imparted from the control bone. So if this is set to 0.5, I would have to move the control bone 30 degrees to make the tail rotate 15 degrees. This would make it easier to make very fine position changes to the tailbone. But the really cool thing you can do is set each bone in the tail chain to have its angle controlled by its parent. And if you adjust all the influence values right, that makes it so that moving the tailbone makes the whole tail curl and uncurl. You can do similar things with position. Here I've got these telescoping pieces that are layer bound to bones. However, in this case, the bones aren't actually parented in a chain, they're totally separate from each other. But I have each one set to use the previous one as a position controller. And you'll notice I have the influence on the X value set to 0 on all these, since I only care about making these move vertically. And the influence on Y is different as you go up the pieces. So when the first section moves, they retract or extend. Now it's hard to control this way because the bones end up overlapping. So I'm going to use the Add Bone tool and make a separate pin bone next to it. And I'll give that bone a name. Then I'll set the root of the telescope's position to be controlled by the point bone handle, but make the influence really low. And if you get that value right, I can just drag the handle directly to the height I want. The last option for bone constraints is bone dynamics. This is actually a way to make your bones animate automatically in response to how their parent bones move. So here I've got a car, and it already has an animation, but this antenna isn't bending in reaction to the movement. So I can select the bones bound to the antenna, and then enable bone dynamics. The settings here let you adjust the level of flexibility and springiness. You'll always want to experiment with this to get the results you want. But once that's enabled, I can play the animation again, and we automatically get the drag and follow-through animation on the antenna. So this is a great way to get extra follow-through on characters without having to do extra animation. So that's it for the bone constraints. Those are a good, easy way to enhance your rig. But we've yet to look at the most powerful rigging feature in Moho, and that's smart bones. We'll start digging into that in the next video. I'll see you there.